RMIT FactLab has been suspended from fact-checking on Facebook. This arose following a debacle where they attempted to fact-check Peter Credlin, and it emerged that they appear to be rather biased against the no side of the voice referendum. Censorship by big tech has been a major issue recently, and this has also been the case with the voice referendum. However, now there's been a rare win against censorship. Now, not long ago, Peter Credlin was essentially censored on Meta as part of Meta's attempts to combat so-called misinformation. In Australia, Meta does this by subcontracting fact-checking to several agencies, one of which is the RMIT FactLab. In this arrangement, the FactLab receives money from Meta in return for engaging in so-called fact checks. Now, we can dispute the utility of the word misinformation. To my mind, it's become rather a weasel word. However, there has been an attempt to combat it. Now, back to Peter Credlin. She stated that the Uluru Statement is more than 26 pages. However, RMIT's FactLab deemed this to be misinformation. They deemed it to be false. Then, using their powers on Meta, they labelled Peter Credlin's reporting as false, thereby limiting its credibility and its reach. People would have to click past a false information banner or warning to be able to see her reporting. This therefore, of course, would be suppressing her statements. However, it turns out the FactLab was actually wrong. Even the ABC's own Media Watch argued that Peter Credlin's comments are, at best, disputed, rather than false. This is especially so given that Uluru Dialogue co-chair Megan Davis has said on several occasions that the Uluru Statement was at least 18 pages. So one could be forgiven for thinking that the Uluru Statement is more than one page. Not only that, even if the Uluru Statement were one page, the other background documents are essential information to understand that one page. I've covered all of this before. In any case, there is now a win. Facebook has suspended RMIT FactLab. This was notionally because Facebook requires that fact-checkers have certification, and FactLab's certification had expired last December. Notably, this is all the way about 8 months ago. Now, that certification requires, amongst other things, that the fact-checker be impartial. That is, it treats both sides of an argument, especially in an election or a referendum, equally and fairly. This especially applies around election times and voting times. Facebook has indicated that RMIT FactLab can of course reapply to become a fact-checker if or when its certification is reapproved. However, that certainly is not guaranteed. After all, there are reports that FactLab has been rather partisan, and Facebook and the certifier would look at this partisan behaviour and wonder whether they should be really recertified. One wonders whether this is why the FactLab allowed certification to lapse last December. The big issue, therefore, is that the FactLab has reportedly been rather partisan, being especially aggressive on no statements and much less so on yes statements. Now, of course, this would be okay if there were only misinformation on the no side and no misinformation on the yes side. However, that's simply not the case. There is plenty of misinformation on the yes side of the campaign. This includes statements that the voice is purely advisory, or that might only make representations about factors that differentially or differently affect Indigenous Australians, such as Mark Dreyfus has said in his second reading speech. However, many of those statements are in fact incorrect, such as Mark Dreyfus's statement. The Indigenous voice, for example, could make assertions and representations on any matter, not simply matters that differently or differentially affect Indigenous Australians. Then there's also the unbecoming issue of the FactLab director's own political statements. Now, he is, of course, entitled to his political beliefs. However, in this context, they create the appearance of bias. And this, of course, is a problem for a so-called fact-checker. Meta's comments about this are actually rather interesting, because it seems several senators had complained to Meta about RMIT FactLab. In Meta's response, which was a letter to those senators, they state, "Dear Senator, I refer to your letter dated 24th of August 2023 and wanted to provide you with an update about some of the changes with respect to Meta's fact-checking program that is taking effect from today. As you may know, at Meta, we have a strong commitment to combating misinformation. Under our policies, we remove harmful misinformation that could cause imminent physical risk or interference with electoral processes, for example. And we invest in a third-party fact-checking program and reduce the distribution of any content that is labelled false by third-party fact-checkers. In Australia, we rely on 3 fact-checkers: AAP, AFP, and RMIT. A key part of our fact-checking program is that our fact-checkers must be certified by the International Fact-Checking Network, IFCN, which requires participating organisations to demonstrate a commitment to non-partisanship and to fairness. We have recently become aware that one of our Australian fact-checking partners, RMIT, did not have a current IFCN accreditation, and that there had been complaints made to the IFCN about possible bias or unfairness in some of the fact checks being applied by RMIT with respect to content relating to the upcoming referendum on the Voice to Parliament. In light of these allegations and the upcoming vote on the Voice referendum, we are suspending RMIT as a partner in our fact-checking program, effective immediately. Once the IFCN has considered whether RMIT FactLab's expired certification should be reinstated, we will again review their participation in our fact-checking program. Please let me know if you have any questions. So it appears that Meta has taken issue with RMIT FactLab's expired certification and possibly also the appearance of bias. It's not totally clear exactly which one drove the decision, and maybe it was a combination of the two. But in any case, RMIT FactLab could potentially start fact-checking again if they get their certification renewed, although that, like I've indicated, might not be certain. The whole situation, of course, is actually rather reminiscent of an academic paper by Francesca Gino and co-authors. Francesca Gino is an academic, or was an academic, at Harvard. However, she's had her own issues. As we'll see, this should not be terribly surprising given the nature of this research. Now, in that paper, they showed that people are more likely to bend the rules if they feel altruistic or morally justified doing so. So, for example, if you feel that one side of a campaign is particularly egregious or particularly evil, then even if your views aren't well-founded, you might feel as if you are justified suppressing them. One wonders, therefore, whether this might be what's happening with some of the attempts to censor the No campaign. That is, that censorship might be a misguided belief that censorship is good so long as it is against your enemies that you are now regarding as evil. This, of course, is a rather disturbing, slippery slope. But regardless, I will leave it to you to decide. I'll leave it to you to decide whether the FactLab should have been suspended or what should go on from here, and whether FactLabs should even exist at all on Facebook, given the concerns that they might in fact be rather biased and not be engaging in fact-checking so much as censoring of political enemies and of wrongthink. Now, while this is a rare win, it's important to not be complacent. After all, the government still has its misinformation bill on the boil. That misinformation bill would coerce social media platforms into suppressing speech that is deemed to be misinformation. However, misinformation is spread so broadly, defined so vaguely, that it could capture a lot of speech, even speech that really should not be actually suppressed. The same applies to disinformation. Not only that, social media platforms don't need to suppress misinformation from the government. The government would be perfectly able to go out and spread false information, and social media platforms would not need to take that down. Similarly with information coming from journalists. That is, the government is exempting itself from the prohibition on misinformation. And it gets worse, because they're actively incentivizing social media platforms to suppress more speech, not less. Because the social media platforms would be penalized if misinformation slips through the cracks. However, they would not be rewarded for allowing more valid speech. Or phrased differently, there's a penalty for allowing any form of misinformation and letting it slip through the cracks, but there's no penalty for suppressing too much speech, which clearly gives an incentive to suppress more and more speech, i.e. to have more and more censorship. The government still has this misinformation bill on the boil. It could still come to fruition, although it appears there's been a lot of backlash against it. And in any case, it's important to be vigilant against further attempts to censor more speech, especially around election times. But in any case, do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, don't forget to subscribe and come back for additional coverage.